Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to what promises to be a very interesting session connecting regions through rail, a very pertinent topic that's been discussed here at the ITF over the years. And the ITF has assembled a great panel here to discuss the intricacies and new developments. This panel will discuss the unique features, advantages, but of course also the drawbacks of rail in fostering connectivity at different regional levels. And we have very different regional levels here represented. We have the Executive Director of the Community of European Railway in Infrastructure Companies, the CER here. We have Libor Lockman with us. We have the CEO of the Association of Swedish Train Operating Companies, Björn Westerbeck, is with us. The Assistant Vice Minister for International Affairs for the Minister of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism of Japan is right to my left, Akiko Yoshida. Glad to have you on board. With us is the Director of the Investment Department of the Moscow Metro, Anton Sevastyanov. And last but certainly not least, he's the Deputy Director for Strategy, Innovation and Technology of MTR, of the MTR Hong Kong, Jerry Lee. So you can tell, great deal of expertise, but a great variety of geographies also presented here. Libor, when we talk about the role of rail, is rail's role as the backbone? We've heard a lot here throughout the sessions about airplanes, about cars, about bicycles, but this is, of course, a session about rail in particular. And is rail's role as the backbone of transport changing? What do you perceive?
I mean, you know that we have got a railway for more than 170, 180 years already, and this role has not changed since. Mm-hmm. So we still believe that it should even be more developed, that the railway is continuing as the backbone of transportation, land transportation, but also, of course, transportation of mid-long distances with regards to transport of the people and the goods over the longer distances. For a very simple reason. I mean, we have got a very good environment record, and environment issues are on the agenda, I mean, of the ITF summit, of the OECD, of the ministers here and there. So this is logical that we have to take into the consideration the advantages of the railway, the benefits that it brings to the society, the economy. So yes, the railway is going to continue to be continuing as the backbone of the transportation. Certainly for the connectivity door to door, it needs to be then somehow, mixed or connected, to say, with the other transportation means. I would not call them necessary modes, but the means that brings you from the origin to destination, or for the last mile connectivity, or the connections from door to the train station and then back. For which there are a variety of the new technologies that we should definitely discuss of how can we connect them into the rail in order to keep and develop even more the role of the railways as the backbone. Whether we talk about the shared or car sharing, whether we talk about the transportation over the drones. I don't necessarily mean the people, but at least the goods, for example. Whether we talk, of course, about the bicycle. So anything that we can have that we can consider as the joint transportation chain, in which the railway, I have to repeat it, is the green mode. And will be green also in the future, because we have to accept that there are certain laws of physics that apply here. So yes, it will continue like that.
So you see the role of rail, the relevance of rail is not decreasing, quite on the contrary, it's increasing, is what you're
Absolutely.
saying.
I mean, both on the side of the passenger and freight. On the passenger side, we have the volumes that are increasing year-on-year basis. So that if you look at the statistics, you will see that we are increasing the volumes of the customers that we transport. On the side of the freight, one can say, the statistics are not that positive, but we have, of course, now the huge wave of the initiatives that should change it for exactly the same reason. We wish to offer the contribution of rail towards the economy, so that we can really help society with using the railways.
Björn Westerberg, rail at the end of the day, and everybody knows it who's been traveling by rail in Europe, for instance, knows that it's still a nationally regulated mode of transport at the end of the day. Very different modes of transport by rail, different quality, different way of approaching this, different appreciations perhaps also of rail in various countries throughout the world and in Europe in particular. Unlike air travel, there's not much cross-traffic travel at the end of the day, not much international cooperation. How do we foster this? And is this necessary? Do we need more international collaboration on that front?
Absolutely. First, I would just like to comment on the momentum of rail right now. And in Sweden, we have something we call the Greta effect. And Greta is a 16-year-old teenager who has sort of transformed the climate of thinking about the future in Sweden and also elsewhere. So we have the Greta effect. That means that she says the house is on fire, you need to act now. There's no planet B. We have new words in the Swedish language. One is flight shame. So everyone is taking the airline is sort of feeling a sort of shame by doing that. It's a new way of looking at it. We see that a homepage at Facebook that is growing faster than the Moore's law. It's like there were 50,000 in January, now it's 100,000 people who look at a certain page for train vacation, taking a train out in Europe. So, and we had a government agreement, a new government in January, that's they agreed about many things. Among that, one thing is that they have to procure night trains out from Sweden out to Europe, and there's a lot of obstacles to make this happening, but they are really focused on this, and then also financing new high-speed lines between Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö, as well as to Copenhagen. But then there is, as you say, there is usually there is no for connecting regions between countries. There is no real national planning. It's regional planning, but there's no national planning. So there's an area that we really need to improve. We need common language for rail. That's one thing, and we also need work rules. For example, the rules that we have was made many years ago, and that requires train drivers and people working on trains to just be away one night. So you can't go for any longer trips. So we need to really focus on how to make this happen.
So the Greta effect that you talked about, is that something that you believe will catch on worldwide? Is that a Swedish phenomenon?
I think it's already catched on in Europe. In several countries, there have been like 100,000 young people out demonstrating in the streets on Fridays and so on.
And you think rail will be the beneficiary of this trend?
Yes, most certainly. I think rail has a momentum now that we haven't had for many years.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about Moscow, Anton, of course, it's especially if we talk about the Moscow region, we're talking about over 8 million people at the end of the day who will have to be serviced by metro and rail. You are, of course, in charge of the investment programs and planning within the Moscow Metro, a very humongous task that you're dealing with on a daily basis. Give us an insight about the challenges that you're facing in trying to, at the end of the day, service so many people on a daily basis. And by the way, for those who don't have translation kits, Anton will be speaking in Russian. So for those of you who are not exactly fluent in Russian like myself, now is a good time.
I will talk a little bit about Moscow. Today's Moscow, and compared to Moscow 10 years ago, in order to demonstrate how we solve this problem. 10 years ago, we were the top #1 when it came to traffic jams and congestion, because more than 40% of the people were using their private car rather than public transport, and we had a lot of illegal taxis, and we looked at international practices, and we found some interesting practices that we implemented. With regards to train and metro, over the past 10 years, we built 75 stations in 54 districts, and we reach 5 million people with that. And the biggest project was the central Moscow ring. So we reconstructed our functioning train system. It was a freight route. And we integrated it into the passengers transport route. And we are serving now 22 districts, and we could take the burden off the streets. And yeah, we also took the burden from the city center. So the metro could also be relieved by 10 to 20%. And we also think that mobility is much more comfortable nowadays. And we reduced the travel times by 10 minutes. I mean, this is not it. We actually want to improve things. We want to increase accessibility in the Moscow region. We are currently working on a project which will connect our urban region, and we will increase the number of routes in order to connect 6 cities in the Moscow region and 24 districts. And part of the project will be finished by the end of this year, the beginning of next year. People will be able to travel even faster. They will save time. And if they now need 2 hours, they will then only need 40 minutes, roughly. And we will also unify our pricing system and seamless transfers between the different means of transport within public transport. And by doing this, we are contributing to intermodality between the metro and the train services.
Traffic congestion and give travelers a better quality of living, if you will, in a sense that now it takes them much less time to get to work, and in that sense have also, if I understand, read to regional developments in Moscow and beyond. Another region that has benefited from regional developments in Japan, of course, Akiko Yoshida, is when we talk about Japan and we talk about Shinkansen and the benefits that it has brought to that development in your country. Perhaps you can share some with us.
Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to speak in this session. And first, let me share with you about the outline of the Japanese Shinkansen. Japanese Shinkansen, as you may know, started its first operation in 1964 between Tokyo and Osaka, which are 2 major cities in Japan, largest ones. And the distance was about 500 kilometers. And the idea was connect these 2 big cities within 3 hours. These are 500 kilometers. And when it started operation, or it started construction, there's already a big traffic volume between these 2 cities. And so after the first operation when operation started in 1964, just within the 8 years, the accumulated profit of the Japanese railway National Railway already exceeded all the cost of the construction and operation within just 8 years, because already there would be huge volume there. And then it was opened in 1964, and they extended the Sanyo Shinkansen line to another big city in Fukuoka, about 600 kilometers something. And it was also so successful. And seeing these successful experiences, another regions wanted to extension of these Shinkansen lines to their regions. However, we knew that first line, Tokaido Shinkansen and Sanyo Shinkansen, already there's a big traffic volume. But for the next stages of the lines, we knew that there is a relatively less traffic volume. So to enable this new project of extension, a special law legislation was promulgated to enable this project. And for initial 2 lines, basically Japanese National Railways, which was at the time a part of the Japanese government, constructed and operated with a loan from private companies or a World Bank, and they reimbursed with just a very relatively short period of time. But for another extension lines, the different financing scheme was introduced. Under that law, 2/3 of the construction cost was borne by central government, and 1/3 was borne by local governments. And operator will bear the cost of the rolling stocks and operation. So that's a new scheme for the Shinkansen. And currently, there are 7 lines in operation. 2 ones are built by the Japanese National Railways, and 5 lines was built by this additional scheme. And another one, planned line, planned lines with maglev technology. So, and that's a basic scheme. And the benefit the Shinkansen brought to the region, as you asked, of course, by shortening the, moving 2 or 3 points, Shinkansen brought a lot of economic benefit and a lot of business activities to the regions. And also, I'd like to share with you some concrete examples by mentioning the economic effect by building stations along the Shinkansen lines. For example, regarding initial Tokaido Shinkansen line, when they built that, they built a new station, which is called Shin Yokohama Station, which is located in the relatively suburban area of Tokyo region. And before that station was built, almost 0 population there and 0 buildings there. However, after the 40 to 50 years after the building of that new station, currently this area has about 7,000 population as a residential population, not very impressive. But because that area was built as a commercial business development, so currently, before that station was built, there's no building at all. However, now we see more than 110 commercial buildings development there. So that's a very clear economic effect there. And also, relatively recently, there's a station called Shinagawa Station, which used to be a relatively big station near the central Tokyo. However, recently they built a new Shinagawa Station for Shinkansen line itself. And after that, for example, the number of employees around that region became more than doubled just within the 5 or 10 years. These are very clear economic effect of the Shinkansen and building stations to the region. And these are relatively big cities, but this economic effect is very clear, not only in the big cities, but also the relatively rural area. For example, in the extension Shinkansen line, as I mentioned, there is a name of there's a city named Saku, which is located very, very relatively rural area, and surrounded by just paddy farms before Shinkansen lines were built. And they built a new station named Saku, and now the land price has increased very much. And Saku City is a rural city, but they enjoy annual revenue of annual tax revenue of about $5 million US or something like that. These are the examples of the benefit Shinkansen could bring about.
So clearly, we heard through the many examples that you've given that the Shinkansen lines certainly have benefited the community, the population in Tokyo and beyond in order to foster regional development. Of course, Hong Kong is another city where regional development has been very much at the forefront and put as a priority, particularly when it comes through the lenses of rail. Jerry Lee, you are at the forefront of these initiatives, and Hong Kong, as I understand, has recently launched a brand new high-speed rail services. What can you tell us about that? What have been the effects?
Yeah, so I come from a region that seems to be constantly building and growing. Hong Kong today has over 8 million people already. Last year, we actually the city was very fortunate. We have 2 mega infrastructure projects that connect into Hong Kong. One is the mega bridge that you probably all heard about. If you haven't, there's a booth, the China booth, that you can find out more information about it. It's a really amazing project in itself. The other project, as you mentioned, Ali, is the high-speed rail connection. So that project actually has been, from conceptual stage to finishing, took almost more than 17 years. So it's not an easy project. It took a long time. So just to put things into some numbers for you, the actual link itself is not very long. It's only 26 kilometers connecting the central part of Hong Kong to the mainland China side. But what is amazing, there are a few key features in this link, right? One is that it actually connects Hong Kong to the main network in mainland China, which at the time of launching was we could connect from Hong Kong to mainland in 44 direct stations and over 29,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. So in itself, right, that we have a slogan when we launched the service to say "Go faster and go further." Right, the faster part from Hong Kong to Shenzhen, which is the town across the border on the mainland side, used to take about an hour in terms of our metro network connections to the border. Now it only takes 14 minutes, 1-4. And if there's a scale effect, right? I mean, that's obviously 26 kilometers, but if you scale it out to the north of Shenzhen, where nearby there's a lot of technology development, Huawei, for example, is nearby, that only takes 16 minutes. So, from the next town, so by the way, Hong Kong is 8 million, I mentioned. Shenzhen is anywhere between 18 to 20 million people, right? The next big town is Guangzhou, which used to take about 2 hours in a direct connection, in an intercity link. Now it takes only 57 minutes. And Guangzhou itself is 25 million people. So you think this region corridor of these just 3 stations, you can do the math, right? It's not a small type of major hub connections. I was in a public forum earlier. I think the professor from the Korean delegate mentioned about how they want to move into express links. I think this is one example of how it connects the regions. The other feature that I want to mention is actually the station itself. Because when we look at most of the high-speed rail stations in China, they are not necessarily in the city center. They are slightly outskirts. And the unique feature about this Hong Kong link is that it's actually right in the middle of the center. For those of you who've been to Hong Kong, it's right next to the International Converse Center, which is 100+ story high, tallest building in Hong Kong. That itself has a connection to the airport directly. There's an airport express, so people can check in their luggage in town in the station, and then they can go and they can have the meetings and they go to airports, and vice versa. When you come in for a meeting from overseas, you can actually get into your office using the express link. And that's 5-minute walk to the new West Kowloon Station, where we launched the high-speed rail. That station connects to with 3 other lines in the metro network. So it has worked quite magically for us, and we see a lot of business activities and daily trips. In fact, if we look at the ticket sales figures, there are people who actually make multiple trips to Shenzhen just because of how convenient the 14-minute travel has been. So yeah, we're quite excited about that.
Yeah, very, very impressive numbers that you put forth, and indeed giving high-speed rail service, living up to that term. So the MTR Hong Kong certainly a role model perhaps for other countries and region. We heard from Sweden, from Moscow, from Japan, now from Hong Kong, and I do spot the Secretary General of the Ministry of Transport of Tunisia here also in the audience. And just for a different perspective, perhaps, Sasi Hamami, I could ask you to briefly talk to us and give us a sense of what rail has done to the regional development in your country.
Oui, merci beaucoup de m'avoir donné la parole pour
well, yes, I'd like to share something about the railway sector in Tunisia, in the Maghreb region as a whole. The transport sector in all of these countries is of great importance, especially for the social and economic development for those countries. Let me remind you that rail transport in Tunisia has been around for 150 years. The first railway line was built in 1872. It was 16 kilometers long between Tunis and some suburban areas of the city of Tunis. And the first tram was built in 1895, excuse me. And a few years later, those lines were already extended. So rail transport has always been a priority in Tunisia, and especially for development of my country, it is of primordial importance. From 2012 to 2020, we have given priority to this sector. 28% of the investments planned for 2012 to 2020 are going into the railway sector. So more than into the air sector, air transport sector and road sector. There are more projects in the city area in order, and also the traffic between the different cities. We want to have a high-speed railway link between the bigger area of Tunis. There are metro lines, and the second biggest city in Tunisia is Ras, and we want to have a railway link there, a high-speed railway link there. We have done a feasibility study, and we have also done a technical feasibility study for a metro line. So we want to renew the railway line network in Tunisia. These are 2,600 kilometers at the moment, and we also want to electrify the railway network. That's quite ambitious. We want to renew coaches and locomotives, both for passenger and freight traffic. Regarding sustainability and the benefits of railway transport in 2015, during the COP25, Tunisia committed itself to reduce CO2 emissions by 2030 by by 41%, and we've taken up measures like national initiatives for urban mobility, focusing on sustainability. We have governance of mobility, promotion of public transport, especially railway sector, financing of public transport, and promotion of capacities. We also developed long-term perspectives within the plan for 2016 to 2020. It's a national guiding plan, which will last until the year 2040. And for this national plan up to 2040, we have considered big projects, mega projects for the railway sector, which prefers the railway sector compared with the road sector. Let me talk about regional integration. Tunisia is at the heart of the Mediterranean, an important geostrategic situation. Therefore, we really focus on integration with our partners. We'd like to promote trade in particular. And also, we want to have direct investments from abroad, so foreign direct investments. And this decision is come up because of necessity, and we need an efficient transport system. And we have defined 2 focus points: investment in infrastructure, promotion of exchange, and harmonization of rules. We are of the opinion that rail traffic is important for the integration in the region. There should be a railway link between Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. It has been around for several decades. However, it cannot be used completely. Currently, it can only be used for freight transport, and jointly with the Union for the Market, we are working on extending this link again, this railway link. Meanwhile, we try to plan a line connecting the 5 Maghreb countries. In the Mediterranean area, we belong to the region for the Mediterranean. We work with associated countries in order to come up with a trans-Mediterranean network for freight and passenger transport. And we'd like to connect it with a trans-European transport network, and that create a link with the Arab countries and African countries. Of course, we need to have a railway component, a high-speed line connecting the 5 Maghreb countries. So at the southern shore of the Mediterranean. In that way, within the Union, we'd like to create such a connection. Let me look towards Africa. We have come up with a task force in order to create an alliance Africa-Europe. And here we work towards the possibilities to create a connection between Africa and Europe. And of course, Tunisia plays an important role because of its geostrategic position. We are close to Europe, but we are located within Africa. We have started a study to really connect all of those countries in our region with a railway line. That was it on the railway sector and the strategic orientation. And as in the past, we are still finding ourselves at the crossroads of civilization, and we need a necessary transport system in order to become a hub between Europe, Africa, and the Arab countries. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Sasi Amami, for giving us an opinion, an idea, an overview of how rail has helped the interregional connection in your country, in Tunisia. I see a lot of similarities. Obviously, supporting Libo Lochman's point that he made, that rail is increasing in importance as we go along and not decreasing. Nevertheless, Libor, public funding to raise funds for public transport in regions and in rail in particular still remains an issue, is still an issue. How do we raise the funding necessary?
I mean, first we have to differentiate whether we talk about the funding which is necessary for the infrastructure, and then possible also funding for the services, so financing the services, let's call it like that. I mean, funding for the infrastructure, I believe we should all agree that if we wish to have better connectivity, better mobility, the high capacity for the mobility in a green one, then we simply have to expand the rail infrastructure. Not only necessarily building the new tracks, but also investing into the new IT technology, which will increase the capacity of the tracks that we have in place today, because of course we have an issue also of the land use besides that. So that's the first thing. And if we are ready, and in the past, I would say 50 years, we've been clearly given the priority to road infrastructure, it's really now the high time to rebalance and giving the priority to the rail infrastructure, because it will really give us the better perspective with regards to the environment-friendly transportation. So far about that. And it is clearly the role of the governments and in the European Union, or also the EU policymakers, to guarantee that there will be sufficient funding for what we need to build, said not only as a hard infrastructure, but also with regards to the digitalization. The second part, of course, of the issue of the coin, we can say the other side of the coin, is whether and how much we need to have the financing also of the public services. And there it depends. And I believe that you've heard it also from the colleagues in the panel. When the demand is high, you don't need to have external financing. You don't need to compensate the service, because the services generate enough revenues from the ticket sales. So in the big agglomerations, it's more or less a self-financing system. In fact, if you need to connect the regions and having a high enough demand, that's all fine. The issue only comes to the discussion when you need to attach also and to connect the regions with a relatively low demand. So the sparsely populated ones, where you still wish to have the mobility guaranteed for those people living over there and not pushing them into the individual cars. And that's the moment that we have to be clever in how to organize the service with regards to finding the way in a cost-efficient way. How do we organize the service that is demanding a compensation at the minimum level, but a compensation that really is that at the end in the benefit of the society, of the economy, because you don't wish to move all the people into the big cities, right? That will not be clever as well. So it will bring, I would say, the secondary or tertiary economic benefits if you somehow compensate also the mobility. And we don't necessarily talk about the railway only, because when we talk about what we have in the regulation, public service obligation, at least on a European scale, I have to say, it encompasses all the transportation mode involved in the mass transit. So from that perspective, we know that with the cost reduction, again involving the new technologies, with kind of the right distribution of the mobile means, so the services of the trains, of the buses, or even the car sharing or carpooling, can bring us to the efficient use of the whole mobility system. But still, obviously, we should think that a certain level of the compensation will simply be needed, because we wish to have a cohesion of the regions. That's why we are sitting here, right?
And if I may follow up, because you said, if done properly, there's enough demand in order for it to generate funds and so on and so forth. Here in Germany, I mean, some of you might have come to Leipzig via Frankfurt. And sometimes you have a schizophrenic situation here in Germany where rail from Frankfurt to Leipzig is much more expensive than you would have had to pay than you fly from Frankfurt. I mean, this is how do we solve the situation? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about environment, we're talking about the Greta effect, but this is no way to go.
This is a very good question, and I'm really happy that you asked that question, because that again goes, with the cost structure of the individual modes that somehow enter into the calculation. What are the costs that you really have to have embedded in in your business model. And yes, rail is not necessarily the cheapest option then in that context, in spite of the fact that it offers the environment benefits. So what we have to consider again is a twofold: how to reduce the costs of operating the railway, implementing, deploying the new technology that will offer us, the cost reduction as much as we can, both on the side of the cooperation with the infrastructure management as well as services for the customers, and increasing the capacity. That goes hand in hand. And on the other side, how we rebalance, this is this obvious, I would say, conflict that we have, that not all the modes have got rightly internalized the external costs, or I would say differently, how to apply flatly and in balanced way what we call the Polluter Pay Principle. Because that's what is missing in this whole scheme, that not all the modes pay all the costs that they are simply incurring, and not to operators of the transportation, but to the society again. And that's the element that really had to be reconsidered. And in that context, we are just waiting, for a few more days, the European Commission to publish a study on external costs or even the full cost of each transportation mode. So we will see the perfect, picture, the comparison, again, Europe-wide, I have to admit, but you will see, how it is in Europe with regards to the coverage of the direct costs, how it is with the coverage of the externalities, how you can really compare what the society pays for those who are using the transportation. And then it should bring us, hopefully, in the next, I would say, regulatory wave. We are going to have the new policymakers in Brussels. We will have the elections coming this weekend for the European Parliament. We'll have new commissioners at the end of the year, or as from November, hopefully. So we can expect, there will be a better perception of what needs to be done on the regulatory side in order to rebalance here. So not necessarily to make the mobility more expensive, but rather how we really find a way to provide the opportunities for the greening of the mobility in the entirety. Which means that I hope when we meet in 5 years from now, then taking a train from Frankfurt to Leipzig will be fast. Will be, for customer will be simply comfortable, and will also be pricely cheaper than, or at least comparable with flying.
Will be more affordable.
And if I will be more affordable, if I take what Björn said a few minutes ago, maybe we come to the situation that there will be no need for the flights then, between those cities, because the rail will be simply efficient enough.
Well, we're looking forward. We're looking forward to that progress, and of course the report that you have announced. Looking forward to reading that, Björn Westerberg. We heard a lot of examples here today from Tunisia, Moscow, Japan, Hong Kong, obviously, and your own country, where rail has definitely led to greater benefit for the people and connectivity. If you look across upon, what are some of the examples that you're seeing beyond what we've heard up until now here?
Yeah, one important aspect, or the three most important aspects of thinking about why we need to improve the connectivity, and why we from the operator side and many in Sweden are proposing the high-speed rail links to be built, is that we need capacity. Capacity is not enough. We have mixed traffic with mixed speed on the big lines, and that means that the faster train have to wait, they have the cargo trains, and you have the regional trains. They're all mixed. You get reduced capacity when something happens. You have delays and so on. So if you can take the faster trains to move them to separate tracks and increase the connectivity between the larger urban areas, and then with the other regions close by to Denmark and even to Germany, with connections through the Fehmarn Belt tunnel, if it's built with appropriate capacity. So it's not just a road tunnel, but it will also be a railway tunnel with the right capacity to Hamburg. Then you will have, for example, 2 hours to Gothenburg, 3 hours to Copenhagen, and 5 hours to Hamburg. So that will create things in people's mind, that you have a connectivity, and suddenly that will be one big region in terms of labor and people moving across borders. That's what happened with the Öresund bridge between Malmö and Copenhagen, that people start working on the other side. It's just the sort of things that is happening. So one thing is that the more knowledge-based sort of economy or region becomes, the more people want to meet. That we are made to meet. That's a habit of people. So we heard yesterday that connectivity is about enabling. I think the Korean presidency said that enabling people to meet, that is connectivity. And so I strongly believe that. But there are some hurdles to do that. The national planning, as I mentioned earlier, and also usually it misses cross-border planning. It's very nationally focused. And for example, the TEN-T rules and funding that we have for the European Union is mostly focused on freight, not on higher speed or high-speed links. So on cross-border in terms of corridors, yes, but not the way the passenger services are made. So we have that. We don't have enough cross-border passenger services in Europe. I think that's an area that we need to improve.
That's something that still needs to expand and improve in the years to come. Are you optimistic that will happen?
Depends on if it's usually as Libor mentioned. I think that was a very good speech about what is necessary and what we need to do. And maybe we get a new Juncker package that we got 4 or 5 years ago, and we'll get it a new Juncker package when the Commission comes. And this will be more a package that is related to infrastructure and railway improvement.
We heard from the European perspective, at least, Akiko Yoshida, that rail, and in particular high-speed rail, will remain relevant in the future and perhaps will even increase in relevance in the future. Is that also true for your country? Is it true for Japan?
Yes, of course. Even now, as I mentioned, Shinkansen has brought about a lot of economic benefits to the regions, and it's still growing. And we are still a lot of construction projects that's going underway about the Shinkansen, extending its network throughout Japan. I mentioned that there is a staged approach in the Shinkansen development in Japan. The first one was just built with a loan financing, and the second one is under a different scheme. The idea behind this later approach was at that time in 1970s, at that time in Japan, the political will is to having seen the very success of these Pacific regions, economic success, the idea was to extend such a development was to the entire region, entire land of Japan. As you may know, Japan is a relatively narrow island extending about 3,000 kilometers. But a relatively densely populated area with big economic activities was only limited to the Pacific Ocean region, connecting the Osaka and the Tokyo area. And again, the idea at that time was that to extend such success to the entire Japanese land. So to enable that political will passed that legislation to bring out the almost same benefit to the other regions. And in these regions, there are relatively smaller traffic volume, but with public funding, as I mentioned, we are still doing that. And although these additional networks are built by constructed by the public funding, but there's 5 factors before the government decides the construction on this network. And one of them is you have to have a clear estimation of the profitability about this extended network. Of course, construction is paid by the government, public sector, but operator has to be confident about profitability based on the accurate demand estimates. That's a very important factor, I believe, for the success of the Japanese Shinkansen.
and the success that can be experienced and seen on a daily basis. Of course, Jerry Lee, we talked, obviously, Libor Lockman and Bjorn Westerberg, they talk from a European point of view, Anton as well. The MTR Hong Kong, of course, is a source of, is somewhat of a role model, if not source of inspiration for countries worldwide. Now, when you travel abroad, where do you see the differences, and what can countries and continents learn from one another when it comes to connecting regions through rail?
I think the good thing in some ways that we're facing very similar type of challenges, right? We talk about infrastructure funding, we talk about how to leverage technology to provide better services. And I am very happy to also to continuously hear, despite this environment, that the role of railway in connectivity, connecting people, and also providing more sustainable type of connections, right? Not just being able to travel, but more sustainable and green way to do it. If I look at the major rail, the major kind of linkage, right? Not just necessarily rail link. You talk about the Sydney, Melbourne. You talk about the Beijing, Shanghai, and for us also in the region, I think there's obviously the externality factor in terms of benefit of connecting. And for us, we are not only connecting regions that are challenged in terms of capacity, right? Because there's obviously capacity challenges in those connections. But it allows us to connect to regions that were not so easily connected with the launching of high-speed rail. And so that strategy has worked quite well for us. For example, even now we can connect from Hong Kong to Beijing on a 3.5-hour flight, but with high speed we can do it in 9 hours. We can actually travel from Hong Kong direct to Beijing with like 3-4 stops in 9 hours. So that actually gives people more alternative. Having said that, that type of long distance is 2,500 kilometers. It's not something that I think the high speed in itself is trying to solve, right? It's actually trying to solve the more regional. I think there's numbers that many reports said, sub 500 is some better business case for that. For us, the reduction in terms of travel time get us to places that people would normally not even be willing to fly, because that 2 or 3 hour travel time seems to be the right amount of time that people don't want to travel so much in Asia. In Hong Kong, to fly to regions such as the middle part of China, such as the eastern part of Guangdong province and the western part, right? Those are the regions that traditionally have not been as well connected, despite the fact that there are flights available. So it's interesting you mentioned the Leipzig example, right? It's actually in a kind of classic kind of fly zone, right? Like, it takes an hour or 2 hours to fly. But the trouble to get to the airport, to all the friction that were introduced, right, is actually not it's not encouraging business and people connectivity. So I think rail plays a very critical role in that. And the more that we, Japan is a classic example, right? It connects the major hubs and allows to branch out to other regions in that space. So I think there are a lot of things we can share. I think there's a lot of experience that we also are learning from everyone. That's why conferences such as this is great.
Absolutely, but it brings together the best practices and examples all across the world. And before I go to the audience, Anton, let me bring you in again. Moscow, everyone who's been there knows, has one of the most beautiful metro stations in the world. But when it comes to servicing over 8 million people on a daily basis, you've already talked how you did it and how you've improved the lives of many as a result. I'm sure you have looked across the pond and looked at other countries as far as best practice is concerned and perhaps sources of inspiration. What have you encountered? What were some of the examples that helped you improve the service in Moscow?
Да, конечно. Во-первых, не 8, а уже...
Yes, of course. It's not 8 million people anymore, it's actually 9 million. And We looked at experiences from Europe and Asia in particular when we thought about how we could make regions more accessible within the Moscow region. If you see that 8 to 9 million people are moving into the city every day, and the service isn't as good as it was at the heart of Moscow. We had a few problems in the periphery, and we had to solve these problems within the Moscow region, and we are now extending our services for the entire region. So this is an administrative unit we're talking about, Moscow, and the instruments or the tools that we wish to apply for transport between the regions. We are thinking about two-story trains or double-decker trains, and we might actually implement that as well. We saw that in other places. And then the passengers' infrastructure when you need to change trains. And we looked at what the Germans are doing there, and also the connection of all different transport modes. So we're thinking about very different things.
For the silence, I had to wait until the translation came on. So clearly you took upon different examples, best practices, as you all have at some particular point, because this is what it's all about, ladies and gentlemen. We have a great deal of expertise in the audience. I think that has become apparently clear, but I know there are a lot of people who are dealing with the rail on a daily basis in their professional life as well. I'd like to bring you in here at some point. If you have questions, remarks, please indicate. So we have microphones assembled here all across the room. I'm looking. The first question is always the hardest, I know. So far, Francisco from the ITF. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Just a very simple question, and it goes to that discussion we were having about the funding. And I think it's for all the panelists, but I would think more specifically to Mr. Jerry Lee and maybe Vice Minister Akiko about the way in which rail can also finance part of the infrastructure by capturing the land value and by the development, real estate, commercial activities in close proximity to the stations. And maybe this is something that is not exactly transferable, what happens in Hong Kong to the rest of the world, but I think it's a good, at least source of inspiration, and could be and already is in some parts, a very important source of funding, and it would be interesting to hear a bit more about that.
Thank you for the question. Happy to pass it on. I think, Jerry, you were...
Yeah, so in Hong Kong, I mean, obviously we're an operator, so we're working very closely with the government, and there's a lot of strategic directions on how this is funded. So in that context, we will have this rail plus property model in Hong Kong, where the funding is supported by the kind of the land assets and the land premium itself. And I will divert the question a little bit from the funding part, right? I mean, I think that financial could be quite clear in that sense, but what it actually drives is a different type of construction, because the operator and the construction, the builder kind of owns that end-to-end in a sense. What that drives is an integrated type of development. So when we build a rail, when we plan a rail, we have to think about how it impacts the people who work upstairs and also the residents that are on top of the building. All that also drives an integration of all the other transport modes, right? Because we know that rail is kind of the backbone, is set up by the, in the Hong Kong development strategy, even back in 1976, if I'm remember correctly, right? That backbone strategy has been there. But what it doesn't set up is how that actually interconnects. That requires a lot of planning and coordination and collaboration with all the other mode of transport. So because of this type of funding, I think it encourages that type of collaboration, and I think it has been working out quite well for us, just beside the funding part.
Akiko Yoshida.
Yes. In Japan, I already mentioned about the financing scheme about the Shinkansen building. And regarding value capture, as you asked, I'm aware that for example, in the academic area, a lot of studies has been made about how the implementation of value capture scheme or something. And as far as I'm aware, in Japan, such kind of, for example, in relating to taxation value capture scheme has not implemented per se, I think. However, as I mentioned, the profitability of the railway operator is very, very crucial to maintain a good railway service, and railway can be sustainable. It's very important. In that sense, I think Japanese railway operators are very good in doing business, real estate business, I think. And in many cases, railway operators are also doing a real estate business, and they build the commercial buildings around the stations, and they can enjoy the profit from these buildings. And it can provide cross subsidy if by any chance they have a deficit in the operation itself. But normally, they should be very successful for the operation, and also in addition from the profit from these real estate businesses.
Let's get more voices in. Björn Westerberg.
Yes, I think in addition to this, I think it's very interesting to listen, for example, to High Speed 2 in the UK. Their purpose, they're not building rail, they're rebuilding UK. The trains are not going to London, they're going to go from London instead. So it's another vision. And also, in the presentation I listened to, they told us that they're going to do it in a way that is so good so you can export the knowledge. There are other sources of income for the nation. It's not just building rail and it's a cost. It's a way of making money in a sense. But also I like the Japanese way of looking at high-speed rail as a high-level service industry. It's more than just a station. It's a lot of things around the station that generates revenue for the government and business, and that the operations are profitable in itself. And another example from when we're planning high-speed rail in Sweden, it's the thing about land capture that is very relevant. So part of the negotiation process for where to build the stations was that all the regions or municipalities have to address the issue of coming up with housing. So if you want to have a station, you have to build a number of 1,000 houses or apartments. So part of this negotiation, when it was finished, they have come up with 285,000 housing or apartments, houses or apartments. And if you take that, give that a value, if you give it a low value, like 100,000 euros for each apartment, then basically that is more than the whole investment cost of the high-speed rail tracks.
Just briefly, because I mean a lot has been said, and of course we are all clear that wherever you build the new line or you connect, and you increase the value of the environment around the stations. So it brings additional revenues, it brings the profit. It's just now the question of how you internalize it back to the rail system. And unlike in the other regions where the rail system is pretty integrated, including, for example, using of the revenues from the station area, or having, I mean, being in ownership of the stations, the European market is pretty different. So we have a number of players. So in our situation, there is nothing like the direct transfer of the profits from one business to another one. We usually have to think of, let's say, the model that is first, of course, I mean, internalizing the profit to those businesses that are operating and that are owners of that. And then through the instrument of the taxes or the charges, we can have the transfer to the rail businesses. So it goes through the treasury. In fact, at the end of the day, there is nothing like subsidizing directly the rail operation or train operations from the profits made on the other services that are surrounding the railway.
Anton Sevastyanov, did you want to chime in? Did you want to address the question?
Möchtest du darauf antworten?
Question as well. Do you want to chime in? You want to jump in?
Ну, что касается финансирования,
One example from Moscow and the Moscow region. Let's say it's quite easy with the metro lines. And when it comes to the railway lines, it looks a bit different. In principle, everything is financed by the state budget. And the state addresses the issue in the following way. How much man-force, how much jobs are created, how many jobs are created if one transport corridor is created or is maintained in the city. That's how Moscow is thinking. So how many jobs are created in the transport sector? How many taxes will I generate? So this benefit is also considered if you build something new or if you modernize things, and then you set priorities. What kind of transport corridors are maintained first, and then.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do we have more questions, comments, remarks? Anyone want to refute anything that you've heard up until now? That doesn't seem to be the case up until then. Please indicate to me if you do. We're slowly winding down here. Libor, perhaps we'll do a final round and looking ahead at the role of rail. You already said that it's going to, but where do you like to see specific improvements as far as rail's role in connecting people are concerned? Where's the gap in the year 2019 where you say this is a hole that needs to be filled?
If you will be talking really about the mobility in the context of the passenger services, so more than the freight, because of course we still have the segment, and Björn was right, in the railway the feature is quite unique compared to the other regions that most of the lines we operate as the mixed traffic, so the freight and the passenger business is on the same tracks, which adds the complexity. But what definitely is the challenge for the future is how do we massively, but really massively automate the system. So how we implement the new technology that would bring us to the cost savings and higher capacity. That's the one thing. How we, of course, in a connection with them, ensure that we will have a sustainable financing of the system. On mainly, again, on the infra side, but we'll need it simply. And that's what I said is clearly responsibility of the governments. So that's those are two elements or two segments. And how obviously, as the third one, we also innovate with regards to the further environment performance, because we believe, and I hope that we will be supported then by the policymakers in future, not just by Greta now and her movement, that there will be a need, towards the implementation of the principle of the Polluter Pay scheme, so that we really will benefit from the environment advantages that the railway is bringing to the society, and not as we slightly even observe today that we are a bit of penalized, by that, which the people may not even know that if you are running on the electric energy, you pay the surcharge for the renewables. That's yes, it is so. So we really have to be clear that we have to somehow set the right trend in order to really to bring the railway where it should be on a market side. Then how do we implement all the technologies that are let's say available today and will be available in the future? And then, of course, at the end, what will be needed if the railway should really be the backbone of the transportation, we have to be well connected with the other available modes, so that we will be really seen as the principal let's say, mode for of the multimodality, so that those connections at the terminals, but not only will be in place, including the simple ticketing across all the transportation modes, that you will simply through one transaction buy the ticket, from the origin to destination, regardless of the means of transport you are going to use. So that's how we see the future, which will bring again, more satisfaction of the customers, and will bring us to the greener mobility. That's what I will repeat all the time.
Greener mobility, this is where we have to head at the end of the day.
That's it.
Yeah. Björn Westerberg, also getting your chance, look at the future. What do we need to do so that rail remains the backbone of transport? How should rail change to improve the connectivity? It's already at a pretty good state, listening to our panelists, but where do you see room for improvement?
I think Libor was right in not just connecting regions, we need to connect with the modes, the other modes. So it's really integrate the system. The beneficiary is the customer, the passenger that's going to use it. So we have to make it simpler for them. And on the way, we have to reduce complexity. And we have a lot of rules. As Libor said, the rail is sort of penalized in a way with so many rules, and there's language rules. For the airlines is one language, and we have several languages, and we simply have to be able to if you take European level, make it more simple and get the funding for rail. Because if we reduce the funding now, we won't be able to reach the climate objectives at all, and a lot of the political part of the idea of the climate objectives is that we're going to transfer a lot of goods and people from road to rail, but we haven't seen it properly in the details yet.
Simplify the process, simplify the whole process. At the end of the day, the construction of it all is your remarks. Akiko Yoshida, also you've already talked about the very good state that Japan is in when it comes to high-speed rail and how it has benefited your country. Obviously, we're always striving to be better and improve. Where do you see room for improvement?
Yes, room for improvement.
Yeah. Or what are the next tasks ahead for you?
Yes, the future of the railway in Japan, or high-speed rail.
Yes.
I'd like to raise a question whether you think the railway is just a public infrastructure or high-quality service industry. In Japan, of course, a railway is infrastructure, public, everyone can, so that everyone can use. But the concept that railway industry should be a high-quality service industry, taking that approach would be one of the success factors for the Japanese railway industry, I think. Because, as I mentioned, for the construction side, of course, sometimes the public funding is necessary because it's a huge amount of funding, requires finance. However, once it's built, it's not the end of the story of the railway. It's just the start of the story for the railway operation. Once it starts operation, you have to maintain the quality of the service or improve the service. Otherwise, you will lose the traffic demand. You have to maintain or increase the traffic demand to sustain the service, the operation. To do so, you have to improve the service. For example, in Japan, long time before, as I remember in my childhood or something, railways was just infrastructure, transport. However, if you come to Japan, for example, and look at the Tokyo Station or Shinkansen or even in the rural area, now you see a very beautifully painted train cars and nice services, carriage is going around in the carrier, providing coffee service or something. So now the rail operators' notion is they are trying to improve themselves as a high-quality service industry to maintain their services, and not only for the demand currently we have, they also making an effort for demand generation, especially through the tourism promotion. In Japan, currently, we experience a lot of inbound tourism boom. Now we are receiving a lot of international tourists coming to Japan, and which actually increase the traffic demand on high-speed rail and even in the rural train lines. And to meet such demands, railway companies are making a very much effort in the promotion and service improvement to receive foreign tourists by, for example, having a foreign language signage or introducing a cashless service or something like that. So such kind of a continuous effort as a service industry is a kind of a key factor for the success of the rail industry. That's what I.
So high quality service is a must if one wants to maintain the success.
So that the railway service can be sustainable.
Right. Anton Sebastianov, much has been done in Moscow. Much still remains to be done. Give us a sense of your future challenges. What are you looking at?
I'd say we have a goal, a clearly defined goal. We would like to have one single ticket, one single fare system for the entire urban passenger transport, be it metro, buses, interurban trains, one ticket for everything, one service for everything, and seamless connections. And we'd like to have intermodal transport. And we have this goal. And then the second idea is that we'd like to improve the services for transport. This refers to metro lines and trolley lines. We have the youngest fleet for public transport and also for railway transport to suburban areas. We'd like to offer a service to people which is so good that you don't have to really think about it. If you want to travel somewhere, you just know that you can trust in the service. You trust in public transport, and we'd like to extend the trust and extend the services, improve services.
Very much in line with what Akiko Yoshida said also, not just maintaining but improving the quality is one of your challenges ahead in order to attract more. Jerry Lee, MTR Corporation, we've heard many ambitious projects that you have already realized have come to fruition where you see the benefits. Give us a sense of what's ahead in the future.
Yeah, so I'm in complete alignment with the other panelists and speakers on how the next wave of challenges we need to solve together, right? Better services, high quality services, also single ticketings, and how to reduce the frictions to make travel simpler. If I may, I think I'll just overlay on top of that a few things that we are thinking. I do believe that in that context, there are a lot of problems for us to solve, and it's a very exciting time for us to try to solve them. In our local system, our model has always been safety and reliability. I mean, that's fundamental for anything rail operation anywhere. With the hard work of a lot of people, we have been consistently achieving 99.9 plus percentage on-time ratio in terms of reliability and safety records. So we want to push that further using technology. That means more frequency in terms of services. The network is quite stressed already. We have 2-minute kind of headway in Hong Kong, but how much more can we do given the existing infrastructure, applying technology? The other one is in conjunction with the excitement of opening the high-speed rail. Now that we're more connected to the other parts, and there's actually a national development plan called the Greater Bay Area Initiative that is probably the biggest thing going to happen in the region. It's really 9 cities on the mainland China side, plus Hong Kong and Macau. How do we provide better seamless connectivity in all kinds of areas, right? And mobility is one of the top agenda in that Greater Bay Area initiative. And the whole region is 70+ million people. Is something like 1/8 or 1/6 of the GDP of China. So it's going to be quite exciting. And Europe, I think, is leading in mobility as a service. Even though, I mean, there's a lot of things that still need to be sorted out. We very much look toward that and see how we can apply some of the concepts into the Greater Bay Area initiative. Data sharing among all the modes of transport is critical. And I remember that 20 years ago in Hong Kong, we had the similar challenge with payment, right? Like intermodal type of payment. How do you actually have concession discounts across different modes of transport? So we formed a consortium among all the operators, and we created something called the Octopus Card 20+ years ago that kind of solve the payment problem with NSC. Now the region is getting bigger, right, with the 70 million people and all sorts of challenge you can imagine, right? Cross-border immigration, more modes of operating, more bus company, more the new type of services like DD and ride sharing, electric scooter, bikes, etc. So all that's coming. How do you actually create that seamless connectivity, right, for mobility across that bigger region? I think it's going to be probably the biggest challenge for us to solve. And I really much look forward to working with the other regions and technology companies and also the other operators in tackling that.
Björn Westerberg, you wanted to add something to what Jerry said?
To financing and funding of rail. Just to comment, everything we want to do assumes that we have money. And we usually don't have as much money that we want to spend. And we see that it's very limited government budgets. There are very limited money from the European Union and to do all these investments so we can reach the climate objectives and so on. So, I mean, there's so much money out there with pension funds and other private equity and so on seeking returns. And if someone could come up with a sort of well-structured product, financial product that could sort of finance investments in high-speed rail in different countries, different regions and so on, that person may be sitting here in the audience or sitting somewhere else in London or New York will strike gold or be really, really lucky because there is a gap between just coming up with this idea that can help funding high-speed rail in the future and take us there much faster with high speed than we hope.
An important challenge that needs to be tackled. But these are exciting times to be in rail, says Jerry Lee. Certainly, of all the examples that we've heard today, whether it's in Russia, Japan, in Hong Kong, in Tunisia, in Sweden, and beyond, Europe-wide, of course, we see that the importance of rail is not going to decrease anytime soon. Quite on the contrary, the prospects for it not just to remain a backbone, an important backbone of transport, but actually enhance that position is quite likely. You have all been very generous in providing and sharing all these examples why rail is and remains important. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the panel session Connecting Regions through rail. A lot of input that I believe our panelists have given us. Please join me in thanking them for their very remark. This is your applause. Thank you so much.